4 days ago on EWTN, Father Mitch Pacwa had an Irish Mariologist, Professor William Anthony Thomas, on EWTN. And at about a minute 39, they touch on Maria Valtorta. And I just thought I'd play you this clip because I would like to respond in charity to what was said about Maria Valtorta and really give a context to this great mystic of our time, because they obviously take a different view and label her as a false mystic. But anyway, let me just play you this clip, and then I do have some information to respond to.
One example of something that was problematic that I also did come across was that, one, not all of the alleged visionaries, but one of them had asked the apparition that came to her if it was good to read a book called The Poem of the Man God by Maria Valtorta. And there are a couple of problems with that. To ask such a question is not the role of any apparition from heaven, is it?
Yes, no, it isn't. And there are many false mystics out there. Maria Valtorta, Vasula Ryden, Luisa Picaretta. Her cause has been stopped, by the way, by the congregation or the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, and warnings have been given about her writings. They're not good. They can be divisive, they can be Gnostic. People who read them get somewhat confused, and people should read the writing on the wall and say, enough is enough here.
Yeah.
Rather than enter into a clique or into a club that is not good. And again, I put it down to the lack of catechesis, the lack of spiritual direction, the lack of proper disposition, the submission of the mind and will to the church's teaching. I mean, if they really wanted to study Mariology, there are fine books, your books, my books, there's lots of them out there. Yeah. And people can set up a catechetical course in Mariology without chasing after the false ones or whatever. As I said before, I've got over 500 of the major Marian shrines of the world, all authenticated by the church. And if I had a million of them, you'd still find the element who'll go to the false ones. Yeah. And that's the sad reality here.
And something, just to go back to this Poem of the Man God, one of the problems with asking an apparition about this is that the book had been put on the Index of Forbidden Books by Pope St. John the 23rd. And though the index was abrogated, that doesn't mean that the books then that were on the index were therefore then approved. That's not what that meant. It just meant you didn't have to ask your bishop permission to read such a book. But and you add to that with the English edition, I don't know about the other languages, but in the English edition, the publisher printed his own imprimatur and glued it to the inside cover. You can't do that.
No. The church, this was always claimed, like Vasula Ryden's work and Maria Valtorta, that it was somehow a supernatural revelation. But the genre of the writing, as the DDF quite rightly says, proves that this is completely fictional. Yes. There's no supernatural element to it.
Yes.
Now, one of the dangers of false Marian apparitions that people are not aware of is the creation of parallel churches. And one of them, I can give you several of them, but one of them is very important. The Palmyran Catholic Church, based in Seville in Spain.
Now, they named it after the city of Palmyra?
Palmyra.
That's in Syria.
Yeah. But this is where there were two charismatic so-called visionaries or followers of a false Marian apparition in Seville in 1968. And one of these, a man by the name of Gomez, alleged that Jesus came down from heaven and ordained him as Pope. And he became Pope Gregory the 17th. And from there, in a very short while, they have grown into a monstrosity of a parallel church, where you now have Pope Peter III, who dresses in white. He's got a college of cardinals, he's got bishops, he's got cloistered nuns in a convent. And of course, they're not validly ordained. They just go through a ritual. There's no grace given to them. They're outside of the Catholic Church, even though they claim to be Catholic. That's one example of following a false apparition.
Yeah.
And I did warn Cardinal Fernandez about this, because he's new to the job. I've been in the job a bit longer than he has.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
So there's a lot to unpack from that brief piece of the program, which speaks about Maria Valtorta, and as if she was lumped in with Vesula Ryden, with Luisa Picaretta, and so forth. So I'm just going to pick through some of these things that were said in this program, and I want to give a more balanced understanding of Maria Valtorta. First of all, they speak about, well, Mitch Pacwa speaks about the fact that one of the visionaries in Medjugorje asked Our Lady if they could read the poem of the man God, and supposedly what she received was that, yeah, it was all true and so forth. So there is a connection there with Medjugorje. I would like Catholics to do one thing when they're studying Maria Valtorta. Do not link Maria Valtorta with other visionaries or other apparitions. Study Maria Valtorta on her own merit. Okay? So I'm not going to... The fact that she pops up, that the visionary asks Our Lady a question, for me, doesn't add or subtract to the work of Maria Valtorta personally, right? As for a visionary not asking Our Lady something when she appears to him, well, there's a few apparitions out there where those that are receiving the apparitions do ask Our Lady questions. You know, it's there isn't like a handbook. Okay, when you have these phenomenon, don't ask questions. Or, you know, asking you shall receive. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But again, I would really like people not to mix up Maria Valtorta and Medjugorje. Each need to stand on their own merits and judged on their own merits, first of all. Second of all, linking Maria Valtorta as a false mystic to Luisa Picaretta and Vesula Ryden, again, they have nothing to do with, the three of them have nothing to do with each other, right? So you need to judge Luisa Picaretta on her own merit. You need to judge Vesula Ryden eventually on her own merit, and I'm not an expert on either of those two women. I do know that Luisa Picaretta's works still have an imprimatur from the Vatican, and I'm sure there's experts out there like Daniel O'Connor and Father Iannuzzi, which would be better able to respond to the whole Luisa Picaretta her mysticism. Again, I'm not an expert. I don't go to any divine will prayer groups. So I have no involvement with either of those. Although I do think Vesula Ryden should deserve more study. So again, let's separate Medjugorje from Maria Valtorta for a second. Let's separate those other mystics from Maria Valtorta. They have nothing to do with Maria Valtorta's works. And then as for a parallel church, they go on to talk to the Palmarian Church and the Palmar Church that I'm aware of. There is no movement or even prayer association. I mean, the only thing that Maria Valtorta has today in the church is a readers group, really. I mean, you have Don Ernesto Zucchini initially that leads a readers group. They reflect on her writings. There is no movement behind Maria Valtorta. I mean, other than her readers, right? I have yet to meet any type of Catholic sect or group or parallel church that has popped out from Maria Valtorta's works. There's no international association of Maria Valtorta prayer groups, although some people can use it in their prayer groups, but really it's more a readers association that I'm aware of. People can correct me on that. Just to be clear, people don't go inventing something that hasn't happened with Maria Valtorta. Again, Luisa Picaretta is a totally different mystic to Maria Valtorta, right? So let's not go putting them all in the same basket and saying they're false mystics. So, and then finally, as regards the index, Father Mitch Pacwa said that the publisher put an imprimatur on the books, the English books. There has been several bishops that have given imprimaturs to publish their works. And again, I've spoken about this in my blog. Okay, several bishops have been given imprimaturs, right, to and have promoted the works of Maria Valtorta. But the reason that Pisani originally in the 1950s published the books is that they struggled to publish with an imprimatur at that time, because the original imprimatur that they had, which was from a former apostolic nuncio or apostolic administrator to Swaziland, the Vatican stepped in and said, look, don't use that bishop as an imprimatur. Go and get a bishop with a diocese in Italy to give the imprimatur, which they did. They went and they got an imprimatur, and then the under Octaviani, the dicastery or the CDF at the time for the doctrine of the faith stepped in and stalled the publication of Maria Valtorta's works, even though Pius XII, in front of 3 witnesses, said just publish the works. But the only reason that they were placed on the index, and everybody who has studied Maria Valtorta knows this, the only reason that these works are placed on the index is because they didn't have an imprimatur at the time. And they were placed on the index at the exact same time as Sister Faustina's works were placed on the index, right? The exact same time, the same moment. They tried to work with the Vatican on this. They tried to make traction, and you can read in the For and Against Maria Valtorta, many cardinals advocating and others not, so forth. So there's been a wide discussion regarding this mystic. There's one thing that I really want to bring up. I mean, and as regards the index, I go on to say that, look, there is life beyond the index. I mean, how many works have been placed on the index only to be taken off the index decades or centuries later, right? So, to be clear, if at the time when Maria Valtorta was placed on the index, 5 works of Padre Pio or about Padre Pio were on the index at that same time, you know, he would have been considered a false mystic if you're going to say somebody's appeared on the index, they're false, you can't read them, end of story, case closed. You know, again, we need to step in and judge Maria Valtorta on her own merits. Professor William Anthony Thomas, he's a Mariologist, and he says, you know, you can read many books on Mariology. Well, there is another Mariologist, a great Mariologist, whose name is Father Gabriel M. Roschini. He's written 125 books on about Our Lady. Great Mariologist of his age, you know, consultant to popes, consultant in the Vatican. He actually moved Maria Valtorta's. He was present when Maria Valtorta's remains were moved from her grave to the Basilica in Florence. And Gabriel Roschini published a book about the Virgin Mary in the writings of Maria Valtorta. So this eminent Mariologist, friend of the Pope, friend of cardinals, one of the leading Mariologists of his time, who had read all of the works of Maria Valtorta, right? Not just the Poem, the Man God, but also her Quaderni, Quadernetti. He read all of her works, and he wrote this book called The Virgin Mary in the Writings of Maria Valtorta. What did this Mariologist say if we're going to be promoting books about Mariology, what did he say? The Mariology found in all of the writings of Maria Valtorta's writings, both published and unpublished, because at the time some of the works weren't published, but they are today, has been a real discovery to me. No other Marian writings, not even the sum total of everything I have read and studied, were able to give me a clear, as vivid, as complete, as luminous, or as fascinating an image, both simple and sublime, of Mary, God's masterpiece. This work reads like a marvellous life of Mary. At the same time, it is a complete course in Marian theology. It is illuminated by the charity of Roschini's filial love for Mary, and enriched by his admirable, profoundly harmonious knowledge. Okay, so an eminent Mariologist. At the time, he was one of the two top Mariologists in the world. Right, wrote 125 books on Mariology, it seems. And he died in 1977. So Father Gabriel Roschini writes this book. This book is sent to Pope Paul VI. And Pope Paul VI responds and thanks him for this book, right? You have the letter there. It's public knowledge. Now, we have to remember that Paul VI, when he became Archbishop of Milan, bought all of Maria Valtorta's writings and put them in the major seminary's library. Paul VI was a secretary to Pius XII during this time of this back and forth between the doctrine of the faith and the Pope about whether to publish or not publish the works. There was a lot of debate at the time, about the supernatural, if they were of supernatural origin or not. Some cardinals, like Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was an expert biblical scholar, a Jesuit, saying, look, let's not get into discussion about supernatural origin, just publish the works. Brentano's works were published in the 1800s, and there was no fuss about it. Just publish Maria Valtorta's works and see the effect on the Catholic world. Anyways, there's a lot of back and forth discussions about publishing or not. But Paul VI would have been there when, for example, they had received an imprimatur. Okay, so people need to understand the reason they're placing the index is they didn't have an imprimatur, the publisher at the time. But they did have an imprimatur which was squashed by the doctrine of the faith, right? So you have eminent Mariologist M. Roschini, Father Gabriel M. Roschini, who has written this book on Marian theology, about Our Lady in the writings of Maria Valtorta. This man studied all her works. I am not a Mariologist and I'm not a theologian, but I have read all of Maria Valtorta's works that have been published in her original Italian. So, and my call to the Catholic world is to study her in her context. I want to go back to the last letter, the last entry in the poem of the man God, or as it's called, the Gospel as revealed to me, as why Christ gave this work to the church today. And just before I go into this, let me just play you this little clip of another Jesuit. I just want to bring this Jesuit into context here at the moment in the life of the church, and then just read you something here from the poem of man God. So just look at this for a second.
The governor of Vatican City is a woman, right? So I think there have been real changes, right? Maybe not to the catechism, but changes in, church practice. For LGBTQ people, I think there's been significant changes. The ones that are perhaps the most kind of juridical would be the allowance of blessing of same-sex couples under certain circumstances, right? I mean, before that document came out, you couldn't do it. After the document came out, you could do it. So that's a change. In addition to these kind of specific things, I think that's a kind of change in teaching, right? I mean, to change the conversation and to change the approach and the tone is a kind of change in teaching.
On issues related to sex, marriage, sex and marriage in particular, right? What is the thing that Christianity teaches, that Jesus Christ teaches, right? That has to be held on to, that is different from what a nice, well-meaning secular liberal listener of this show might believe about sex? What is the Christian difference that needs to remain no matter what kind of conversations and evolutions we have?
That's a great question. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a moral
Lord.
theologian, so I'll try my best to answer that.
You are a Jesuit. You are a priest. You are, a man. I think you're eminently qualified.
Thank you,
well,
Ross.
thank you.
Yes, no dissembling.
I would say reverence for the other person. I would say sex and sexuality is something that is sacred. Not using the other person. And the value of monogamous relationships. Well, Jesus doesn't teach much on marriage. He teaches a lot on divorce, right? His first miracle is at a wedding feast, so there's a positive outlook.
Positive. He's pro
he's
that marriage at least.
He's pro that
he
marriage.
He favored that one.
He, of course, himself is celibate. He doesn't get married for a number of reasons. But I would say that's the distinctive Christian contribution today.
So when you hear a priest like Father James Martin, and he's not the only one, there's many in the church that reinterpreted sacred scripture, you would ask yourself, oh, Jesus didn't talk much about marriage. So what does that imply? Well, look, that marriage couldn't evolve between a man, a woman, a woman, whatever, just we know where James Martin is going. And let us not forget that he is promoted by the Vatican. He gets invited by all of the Irish bishops to Maynooth here to lecture them on LGBT stuff. And so, we're trying to say, well, Jesus didn't say this and Jesus didn't mention that. So look, that gives us free rein to promote what our agenda. Okay. And in the midst of this, in the 1940s, what does Christ say? Christ comes in the last chapter of Maria Valtorta's work, which speaks about the farewell to the work and the reasons that have induced me to enlighten and dictate the episodes of mine. We see that, the gospel given by me and for all men, the perfect nature from the beginning of my doctrine that has not been formed as it is through successive transformations, but was given as it is, the doctrine of Christ, of the time of grace, the kingdom of heaven, and of the kingdom of God in you, divine, perfect, immutable, the gospel for all those thirsting for God. And at the end, he just said something else, which I underlined here. If anyone adds anything to them, God will add to him every plague mentioned in the book, and that can be understood for all the revelation, the last completion of which is the revelation by John. I reply to you that with this work no addition was made to revelation, but only the gaps brought about by natural causes and by a supernatural will were filled in. And if I wanted to take pleasure in restoring the picture of my divine charity as a restorer of mosaics, thus replacing the tesserae or missing, reinstating the mosaic in its complete beauty, I've decided to do it in this century in which mankind is hurtling itself towards the abyss of darkness and horror. Can you forbid me from doing this? And in the poem of the man God, in the first year of the public life, we see Christ catechizing, teaching in the clear water, right? And where James Martin says Christ didn't talk much about marriage, I think Christ did talk about human relationships and marriage, and he taught how we were supposed to live as Christians, right? Now, at this moment, the confusion in the Catholic world has risen to the very top of the church. That you would have somebody who's member of the communication team of the Vatican, a synodal member, a Jesuit, a priest, who has had the ear of Pope Francis for all of those years, would come out in an interview and says, well, Christ didn't talk much about marriage, and I'm not a theologian. What a cop-out. What an utter cop-out. I'm not a theologian. I happen to be ordained, but I'm not a theologian. I'm going to fill you in, Catholics. You might know this, but guess what? When you study for the priesthood, they do send you to some theology classes for a few years, right? Maybe James Martin missed these out. But again, it's not really about James Martin, because he's just one of many who have taken liberties to read into sacred scripture what isn't there, and to put into sacred scripture what definitely isn't there, and then try to sell it to us. And Father Mitch and the Mariologist there, Professor William, were speaking about false church. Well, guys, look within our own church. Can we not say that there are false theologies and false exegesis really present in the church today? You know, I mean, Father James Martin, in that interview, he says, look, we can bless same-sex couples in certain circumstances now. I mean, we all saw what he did after Fiducia Supplicans came out. Christ and his apostles would never have done that. They would not. It's not part of the apostolic faith or what Christ taught. And, you know, to say that Christ didn't say this, well, then he sends his prophets, then he sends his mystics. And again, in the works of Maria Valtorta, you see how Christ taught. You know, go through the whole catechesis that Christ is giving in the clear water. So, to recap, after all this long episode here, which I wanted to respond to Father Mitch and to the Mariologist there. There are Mariology, but high Mariologists, experts in Mariology, who have published on Maria Valtorta, who have received from popes themselves, letters thanking them for their work, you know. There have been popes that have promoted and read Maria Valtorta, such as Pope Pius XII, who did read her works. This is noted. He received the 3 members of the Servites of Maria, in which he said, look, publish her work as is. You also have other biblical experts in the church, such as Blessed Gabriel Allegre, who translated the Bible into Chinese. I mean, he heavily promoted Maria Valtorta. And he's a biblical expert. And again, lastly, let's not confuse her with Palmarian Church or Luisa Picaretta or Vasula Ryden or Medjugorje. Maria Valtorta stands on her own merits. Medjugorje doesn't make her more true or less true. She has no association to those other mystics. I don't know what they're going on about parallel church. There is no Maria Valtorta association out there. There is no... And when I say association, I mean there's no Maria Valtorta congregation or lay movement. There's a readers group. That's about it. And it's as far removed from a parallel church as you can get. That is the reality. And so let's study her works on her own merits. Let's study Maria Valtorta. And the miracle of Maria Valtorta's works are in her works. She could not have written that work in a bedroom. I mean, the amount of knowledge data you would need to do, because it's impossible for her to have understood Jewish world, Jewish topography, to speak of places that when she wrote it didn't exist on official maps and only later were discovered. I mean, the miracle is in her writings. And I ask people to read her writings. As regards the index, the church, even under Cardinal Ratzinger and under Fernandez, they've never come out and given us a clear explanation as to what is in her writings that goes against the faith and morals of the church. Because if it was a work like the Book of Mormon or some other fictitious writing, they would be pretty clear in saying, look, this book goes against the faith and morals of the church. And if it did, they would have stopped bishops giving imprimaturs for the translations that have happened in other languages in other places, like in Asia and so forth. And again, we've already spoken about this, and Steve Austin has, the encyclopedia, and there's oodles of information on this. And I just think it's sad to see EWTN just skimming over her, like as if this mystic was false, which she isn't, in my opinion. And her work truly is for our time. It truly is. You know, when you have Jesuits, well-known Jesuits, saying Christ didn't speak much about marriage, ergo, we can, you know, develop marriage a little bit more. Ergo, you know where this is heading. Christ did speak about marriage. He spoke about it many times, and in the poem of the Man God, he's pretty clear about his teaching on this, and about family, sexuality, and so forth. So, look again. I just give this in a spirit of love for the church. There is life beyond the index, you know, placed on the same. These two authors were placed on the index at the exact same time. And, you know, nobody's saying that Saint Faustina is a false mystic or a saint today. And the same with Maria Valtorta. She deserves to be studied on her own merits and not mixed up with other items in the church. And again, if you want a book on Mariology, read the writings of Gabriel Roschini, The Virgin Mary in the Writings of Maria Valtorta. Read his book. He's actually an excellent Mariologist. I mean, it has a very theological schema. This is what others have said. There's tons of footnotes. There's tons of explanations on mystical phenomenon, on how to interpret Maria Valtorta. He is an expert, you know. And this is one book which has received a thank you from a saint in the church, a pope in the church, Paul VI. The letter is published there. Read this book, and you know, I don't know much about the writings of Professor William, but I'm not a theologian and I'm not a biblical expert, but I have read all of the works in their original Italian of Maria Valtorta, and I do think she deserves to be studied on her own merits. In this time of great confusion in the church, Christ comes and he sends his mystics, his prophets for our time, you know. And again, as a faithful Catholic, I'm the most far removed from trying to create a parallel church or a schismatic church or anything like that. I have absolutely no intentions, and I don't know of any other Maria Valtorta reader that would do that either. There's no movement out there, nothing to do with Palmarian Church or Palmarianism or any of these other groups. Maria Valtorta made no money from the work because by the time it was published, you know, she didn't start any movement. She was paralyzed, bedridden until she died in the early 1960s. And again, she needs to be studied on her own right. So anyway, God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.